Santa Monica, California, June 22, 2011. An elderly man sits alone in a modest apartment 2 blocks from the beach. Neighbors know him as a quiet, polite tenant who feeds stray cats and rarely raises his voice. They call him Charlie. For 16 years, that is who he has been, not just to them, but on paper, in records, in the careful architecture of a life built entirely to not exist. Then on this ordinary afternoon, FBI agents knock on his door. And the man who answers is not Charlie at all. He is James Whitey Bulger, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, and for over a decade, the second most wanted fugitive in the United States, trailing only Osama bin Laden. How does a man who once ran an empire built on murder, extortion, and fear disappear so completely that he becomes invisible, hiding not in some distant jungle, but in a beachside apartment, under the noses of a country hunting for him? There was no single trick. There was something closer to an illusionist's discipline. Misdirection sustained for 16 straight years, a magic act with no audience and no applause, where the only reward for perfect execution was staying alive and unseen. The trick wasn't sleight of hand. It was the art of making an extraordinary man look like nobody at all. James Whitey Bulger was the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American organized crime syndicate that controlled much of Boston's criminal underworld for decades. But his story is not simply one of criminal ascension. It is a story of betrayal at the highest levels of law enforcement, of a partnership between a gangster and the FBI that corrupted the very institution meant to stop him, and of a disappearance so thorough that it became one of the most extraordinary manhunts in modern American history. This documentary is not just about violence or power. It is about identity, how a man reconstructed his entire existence, piece by piece, to become someone else. And it is about what his eventual capture revealed, that the greatest danger organized crime ever posed wasn't just what happened on the streets of Boston, but what happened inside the offices of the people sworn to stop it. To understand how Bulger vanished, we first have to understand how he built the power that made vanishing necessary. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born in 1929 in Boston, Massachusetts, and raised in the Old Harbor Public Housing Project in South Boston, a neighborhood known as Southie, defined by tight-knit Irish-American families, fierce local loyalty, and limited economic opportunity. It was a place where reputation mattered as much as money, and where the line between respected local figure and criminal could blur early. Bulger's younger brother, William "Billy" Bulger, would go on to become one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts, eventually serving as president of the Massachusetts State Senate. The contrast between the two brothers, one a lawmaker, one a lawbreaker, would later become one of the most scrutinized relationships in the history of American organized crime, though the exact nature and extent of what Billy Bulger knew about his brother's activities remains disputed among historians and was a subject of congressional hearings. As a teenager, Whitey Bulger fell into petty crime, theft, forgery, and eventually more serious offenses. By his early 20s, he had already served time in juvenile facilities. In 1956, he was convicted of armed bank robbery and sentenced to federal prison, serving time at institutions including Alcatraz. According to his own later accounts and those of researchers who studied his case, he also participated in a CIA-sponsored program at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta that tested the effects of LSD on inmates. An experience Bulger would later claim left him with lasting psychological effects, though the full impact remains a matter of debate among those who have studied his life. He was released in 1965. It was after this that his path into organized crime accelerated in earnest. Upon his return to Boston, Bulger began working his way through the city's criminal networks, eventually aligning himself with the Winter Hill Gang, a powerful Irish-American crime organization. Through a combination of calculated violence, strategic alliances, and a reputation for ruthlessness, he rose through its ranks. By the mid-1970s, Bulger had become one of the gang's central figures, controlling operations that included loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, and illegal gambling throughout South Boston and beyond. What separated Bulger from many of his contemporaries, according to investigators and journalists who studied him closely, was his discipline. He was calculating rather than reckless, and he understood that surviving in organized crime required not just controlling rivals, but controlling information. This understanding led to the most consequential and most corrosive relationship of his criminal career. In 1975, Bulger began working as an informant for the FBI, primarily through his handler, Special Agent John Connolly. Officially, Bulger was providing information that helped the FBI dismantle a rival organization, the Patriarca crime family, which had ties to the Italian-American Mafia in New England. But according to court records and subsequent investigations, this arrangement worked in both directions. In exchange for information, Bulger allegedly received protection from prosecution, advance warnings about investigations targeting him and his associates, and according to multiple later court findings, cover that allowed his own criminal operations to expand largely unchecked. Federal investigators would later determine that this relationship allowed Bulger and his associates to operate with a level of impunity almost unheard of in American organized crime. By the 1980s, Bulger's influence extended across nearly every significant criminal enterprise in Boston. He controlled loan sharking operations that generated enormous sums through predatory interest rates. He oversaw extortion rackets that forced local business owners into paying for protection. He was linked, according to prosecutors, to drug trafficking operations that flooded Boston neighborhoods with narcotics, even as he sometimes publicly claimed to oppose drug dealing in his own community, a contradiction historians point to as characteristic of the calculated image he cultivated. Bulger also cultivated a public image carefully separate from his brother's political prominence. While Billy Bulger held legitimate power in the Massachusetts State House, Whitey held illegitimate power in the streets, and the coexistence of these two forms of influence within one family became one of the most examined dynamics in Massachusetts political history. Behind this power, however, was a documented pattern of extreme violence. Investigators and later court proceedings connected Bulger to numerous murders committed over the course of his criminal career, killings of rivals, informants, and even people connected to his own organization who were seen as liabilities. These killings were not incidental to his power. According to prosecutors, they were central to maintaining it, eliminating threats before they could materialize and sending unmistakable messages to anyone who might consider crossing him. Yet the very protection that allowed this empire to flourish also created a hidden vulnerability. The FBI relationship that shielded Bulger from prosecution meant that his survival depended entirely on secrecy, and secrecy, by its nature, cannot last forever. Cracks began to appear in the 1990s. Journalists at the Boston Globe, particularly through their Spotlight investigative team, began digging into rumors that had circulated for years. That Bulger's remarkable ability to avoid prosecution wasn't due to skill alone, but due to a corrupt relationship with federal law enforcement. In 1995, facing an imminent racketeering indictment, Bulger received what investigators believe was advance warning from his FBI contacts. He fled Boston just before his arrest, beginning what would become 16 years as a fugitive. The subsequent investigation into how Bulger evaded capture for so long revealed a scandal that extended far beyond one criminal informant. In 2002, FBI agent John Connolly was convicted of racketeering for his role in protecting Bulger and warning him of investigations. Further investigations revealed a wider pattern of corruption, prompting a Department of Justice review and years of litigation from families of Bulger's victims, who argued the FBI had effectively enabled a serial killer to operate in exchange for information. Meanwhile, Bulger himself had vanished. He traveled internationally at first, reportedly moving through Louisiana, Mississippi, Chicago, New York, and eventually settling with his longtime partner, Catherine Gregg, on the West Coast. Using false identities, most notably the name Charles Gasco, the couple built an unremarkable life that avoided nearly every pattern law enforcement typically uses to track fugitives. They paid rent in cash, avoided using their real names for any official documentation, and Bulger reportedly kept his interactions with neighbors minimal but friendly, careful never to stand out in either direction. For years, the trail went cold. The FBI placed Bulger on its 10 most wanted list, and public tip lines yielded little. The question that had haunted investigators for over a decade remained unanswered. How do you find a man who has made invisibility his life's work? The break came not through traditional investigative work, but through public media. In 2011, the FBI launched an unusual public awareness campaign, specifically targeting the demographic most likely to encounter Catherine Gregg, running television advertisements aimed at women, since Gregg was known to have had cosmetic procedures and frequented salons. The campaign led to a tip from a former Icelandic model who had lived in the same Santa Monica apartment complex and recognized Gregg from television coverage. On June 22, 2011, FBI agents lured Bulger out of his apartment under a pretext and arrested him without incident. Inside the apartment, agents discovered an extraordinary cache, over $800,000 in cash and more than 30 firearms, evidence of a man who, despite his quiet exterior, remained prepared for violence or flight at any moment. Bulger was returned to Boston to face trial. In 2013, after a lengthy federal trial that revisited decades of testimony from former associates, victims' families, and law enforcement officials, Bulger was convicted on multiple counts including racketeering and complicity in 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. His story did not end quietly, however. In 2018, at the age of 89, Bulger was transferred to a federal prison in West Virginia. Within hours of his arrival, he was murdered by fellow inmates, a death that itself remains the subject of ongoing scrutiny, given his age, notoriety, and the reported failures in inmate classification that placed him in general population despite the obvious risks. The story of Whitey Bulger is inseparable from the story of institutional failure. His decades of violence were not simply the product of one man's ruthlessness, but of a law enforcement relationship that prioritized results over accountability and secrecy over the safety of the very communities it was meant to protect. In the years since his capture and death, Bulger's case has become a case study in the dangers of unchecked informant relationships within federal law enforcement. It prompted reforms in how the FBI manages informants, increased oversight requirements, and renewed scrutiny of the historical entanglement between organized crime and public institutions in Boston. For the families of his victims, many of whom waited decades for any form of accountability, his conviction offered a measure of closure, though many have said publicly that no sentence could fully address the scale of loss they experienced. Bulger's 16 years as a fugitive remain remarkable not because of any single trick of disguise, but because of what they reveal about identity itself, that the most effective way to disappear is not to become someone extraordinary, but to become someone utterly unremarkable. He did not hide behind masks or elaborate schemes. His only true magic trick was ordinariness itself, a quiet apartment, a familiar face at the corner store, a name that meant nothing to anyone. The best illusion, it turns out, was never a costume, it was silence. In the end, the man who once commanded fear across an entire city was undone not by a rival gangster or a daring federal raid, but by a stranger who happened to recognize a face from a television commercial. It is a reminder that no empire, however carefully built, and no disguise, however carefully maintained, is permanent, and that the past, however long buried, has a way of resurfacing when least expected.